Hello and welcome. I'm Andrew Denieri, resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you for joining us for this Atlantic Council discussion today. How long can Russia sustain its aggression in Ukraine? We're going to have a moderated conversation with a great group of experts, and then we'll turn to our virtual audience for question and answer in the last half of our hour. To submit your questions, go to askac.org. That's askac.org to submit audience questions. And now I'm delighted to introduce our group of panelists today. Joining us on travel from Europe, we have Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. We have Vladimir Milov, a research associate at the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, and a former Deputy Minister of Energy of the Russian Federation. We then have Dr. Ora Sabados, a senior journalist at Independent Commodity Intelligence Services. And finally, Dr. S. Frederick Starr, Distinguished Fellow for Eurasia and the Chair of the Central Asia Caucasus Institute at the American Foreign Policy Council. Thank you all for spending your hour with us today. We're going to get into the discussion that I mentioned on how long Russia can sustain its war against Ukraine. But first, I think given the diplomatic frenzy of the last few days, we owe it to our audience to break things down a little bit. And so I first want to go to Vladimir and then to Ambassador Herbst for their very quick reactions. Vladimir, what has been the impact in Russia of first the phone call between President Trump and President Putin, and then the initial U.S.-Russia meeting in Saudi Arabia today?
Hello, everyone. Great to be with you. There's been a flurry of optimistic estimates in Russia in the past few weeks, even before Donald Trump took office as the 47th president. Just to name a few, Russian stock market has rallied. It's now up nearly 40% since mid-December lows, simply because of the optimism of any potential peace deal and lifting the sanctions. The ruble has strengthened again significantly. Still, these are mostly expectations and hopes. But every day adds some more credibility to this optimism, because we see a lot of promises and statements from the American side which go really very far in talking about investment opportunities, potentially lifting the sanctions, and also basically making Ukraine to give significant concessions to Russia, which is, I mean, if you just listen to what Russian sources are saying openly and privately, they read it as a complete victory, as a very premature concessions on the American side, which will open major opportunities and significantly reduce the sanctions pressure. So again, the way Russians read all the recent events are extremely optimistic for Putin's system. I think this should serve as a major caution for the American side in the way they would want to proceed.
Thanks, Vladimir. Ambassador Herbst, anything to add on the U.S. side there?
Well, I agree this is a very unusual way of negotiating with Moscow, especially since Trump said in his first week as president that the principal obstacle to peace in Ukraine was Putin, and spoke about the nasty consequences for Russia if they do not show themselves amenable to compromise. It's also, that same theme was echoed by Vice President Vance last week, reacting to criticism of Secretary of Defense Hegseth's discussion in Munich. So, but it is true that Trump is an idiosyncratic negotiator. And we're seeing very similar parallels between his approach to Putin now and his approach to the North Koreans during his first term, where he alternated between bluster and flattery, with perhaps higher on the flattery side. And we're seeing that now. If Trump is serious about achieving a durable peace, he's going to have to show a much stronger hand to the Kremlin, because Putin has no interest in accepting compromise. He wants political control of Ukraine. And flattering the Kremlin is not the way to get that objective. Excuse me, it's not the way to stop Putin and get Trump's sustainable peace.
Thank you both. I'm sure we'll have more questions about this from our audience in the second half of our discussion today. But back to the topic at hand. Vladimir, back to you. You've written extensively about the war and the Russian economy and the effect that the war has had on Russia and its economy and economic prospects. How can you describe a little bit about how Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has impacted the Russian economy and how that's maybe developed or changed between 2022 and today?
Well, Russian resources are clearly and rapidly depleting. This is pretty measurable by all the, imaginable merits and criteria. Financially, for instance, Russian government rainy day fund, the liquidity part of the National Wealth Fund, is nearly out of cash. It had reduced to about 1/3 where it was when Putin invaded Ukraine full scale 3 years ago. Budget deficits are running wild. The government cannot control them. Last year's federal budget deficit exceeded the initial figure approved a year ago by 2.2 times. And we just saw a figure released by the Russian Ministry of Finance for January this year, 2025. The deficit in federal spending for January alone is already 1.5 times higher than the overall planned deficit for the whole of this year. And we see that because of the sanctions, Russia's current accounts balance is rapidly shrinking. Russia cannot really move on with import substitution because of lack of access to critical technology and capital investment skill because of the Western sanctions, which is why imports are growing substantially while export revenues are stagnating. We saw December and January like near zero trade balance and negative current account balance also because of the continuing capital outflows. We have wild shortage of manpower, both at the labor market and in the military at the battlefield in Ukraine. You can basically look at the recent reports by independent Russian media, which indicate that the intensity of the movement of advanced movement of Russian troops is down to long month lows. It's back to sometime in June, May last year, and we saw the peak of advances in the October-November period. But now Russia's ability to advance militarily had rapidly shrank. We see significant caps in the Russian military production. Also, it's been growing recently, but it is also significantly exhausted in terms of available manufacturing capacity. Russia has difficulties acquiring new high-precision machinery because of the sanctions and blocked supplies of critical technology from the Western markets. So on all fronts, also inflation is becoming a persistent economic problem. Central bank can do little about it because basically the reason for inflation, as explained by central bank, is the output gap. They keep injecting a lot of money to boost military production and to boost other civilian sectors, but the output, the supply side is not catching up because of the same lack of technology due to sanctions. So, I mean, coming back to this idea of peace talks and negotiations, just a few more months with this extreme resource depletion and exhaustion on all fronts, and Russia would have been in a much more vulnerable negotiating position, and it would have probably agreed to give away major concessions because it cannot advance militarily, cannot sustain the war effort for much longer. So again, coming back to my initial comments, what we see and this rush into signing something into Russia is extremely premature because we're just nearing the critical resource depletion levels on the Russian side, financial resources, manpower, military production. I think really giving away concessions to Russia at this point is premature because the position for the West and for Ukraine, obviously, in the next few months will be far more advantageous with Russian resources getting rapidly depleted. I think I'll stop here.
Thanks, Vladimir. Ora, I want to bring you into the discussion here, in part because Vladimir mentioned Russia's export revenues and its economy, of which energy obviously is a huge part of that, oil and gas. But Ukraine's drone strikes have actually knocked out a significant portion of Russia's ability to generate and export these hydrocarbons. Can you talk a bit more about the damage to Russia's oil and gas sector and how Russia has adapted or not adapted?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for the invitation to join you. I would very much echo what Minister Milov just said, that Russia is really moving to a point where in the energy sector, it's also reaching fall in revenue, fall in production for oil and gas, etc. And of course, in recent months and weeks, we've seen an intensification of Ukrainian drone attacks against this infrastructure. And between September 2023 and February 2025, there have been around 100 or a little over 100 drone strikes against these critical points of infrastructure in Russia. But these attacks have intensified since the start of the year. And the intensification is not just in the sheer number. For example, in January, there were 13 or 14 attacks compared to only 4 in December and 2 in November. But also in the actual distance. Ukrainians have been striking very far out, for example, 900, 1,000 kilometers away in Engels, in there was an oil depot, Crystal oil depot in Engels, 900 kilometers away. Another, a couple of refineries also quite far out. And also what we've seen this year is the fact that the Ukrainians have been pounding pieces of infrastructure, not just once, but twice or even 3 times. And the attacks have also been very sophisticated. We've seen swarms of drones being unleashed against these pieces of infrastructure. I include here refineries, as some of the bigger refineries like the Lukoil Volgograd refinery, which was struck twice within the space of less than a week. Also oil depots, which I just mentioned. Pumping stations for pipelines. I'm talking here the Druzhba pipeline, which takes oil to Europe via Ukraine. Then the Baltic pipeline that takes oil to Ust-Luga. And really, I mean, the Ukrainians have really intensified, as I mentioned. On the gas side, there were fewer attacks. There was a report of an attack against the Turk Stream pipeline, which takes gas to Russia, the only remaining pipeline corridor to Europe via Turkey. I think the Ukrainians took responsibility. Personally, I'm not convinced that they were aiming at the Turk Stream pipeline. I think this was a collateral victim as they were trying to hit something else. And of course, the most important piece of infrastructure that was struck last year was the Suja metering station right on the border with Ukraine. And I would say that the fact that Ukrainian troops hit the metering station and impaired it was actually a critical point during the negotiations between Russia, Azerbaijan, and all other stakeholders involved for the renewal of the gas transit through Ukraine. And nobody, eventually these talks collapsed because nobody really wanted to transit gas without having accurate metering on the Russian side of the border. I'll stop here, but we can go into more details regarding the impact. Sorry, I should maybe just say one thing because you asked me and I forgot. Very quickly, of course, the Russians mobilized equipment to counter these attacks, but because, as I said, because the Ukrainians were unleashing these swarms of drones, it has been nearly impossible to capture all and to repel all of them. And on the other hand, the fact that there were these attacks which knocked out around 10-12% of the refining capacity, the price of refined products, gasoline, diesel, has gone up. And of course, it has an impact on the Russian economy. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you. Super interesting detail. And I do want to circle back to some of the points you mentioned. Dr. Starr, over to you for how this is all playing in Russia. I think one of the main fora of domestic dissent, actually, that we've seen in Russia is among these military bloggers online and especially on Telegram. You know, the dissent maybe crested around the time of the Prigozhin mятеж, and now it's kind of edging back up with some mill bloggers expressing displeasure at how the war is going and how the Kremlin is approaching this. And even before Trump's really friendly statements last week, we saw major Russian media figures like Margarita Simonyan and Vladimir Solovyov suggesting that maybe it's time to look toward ending the so-called special military operation. What do you make of all this?
Well, first of all, hats off both to Vladimir Milov and Ara Saladas for their comments. They're very, very important. And their conclusion, if I can offer it in just a couple of words, is that Russia's assault on Ukraine is collapsing. It's collapsing on the military front. Any army that sends troops into battle on an old Lada or in a old Russian version of the BMW motorcycle, it's lost, and they know it. And that's reflected in the internal dialogue very, very much. What I'm about to say is accessible, readily accessible. I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C. and in New Orleans. It's all accessible on the internet. And where are our geniuses who should be following this? And why are they not reporting what I'm about to say to the president and key people in our policy community? Now, let me say, first of all, the social impact of what Ara spoke about is immense. It has created a huge inflation. Cost of living has gone up, and that affects people's real lives, how they live. They live outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. They live amidst decaying infrastructure. And this is where millions and millions of Russians live, and they lack heat, they lack water, and poor maintenance. They go for medical help. There are no doctors. They're suffering. Not to mention the psychological impact of coffins being delivered back home, and in many cases, coffins aren't delivered because if the coffin isn't delivered, if a dead body isn't returned home, they don't get their payment, and the government saves some cash. All of this is reported on Russian TV now, and on both official and unofficial bloggers. The bloggers are on the right, left, and center, and they're absolutely outspoken. They're blunt. They're direct. I don't know how we've missed it, but that's 6 months ago. The bloggers, including the most authoritarian of them, were if they were criticizing the government, they referred to the leadership, and then they turned to our leaders, and now in the last month or so, it is the leader or even Putin by name. This is a big shift. This is a huge shift. On TV, that you see the same evolution. You see, for example, not just criticizing the president openly, that's happening, but also you're getting criticism of his key appointees, Mr. Belousov, whom he appointed. Very proud of this appointment. Here's an economist who is going to straighten out everything. Belousov, instead of straightening out everything, which he's unable to do, he goes to the Duma and starts attacking Duma members for their corruption, although he's a member of the Duma. I mean, really, this is civil war. And the Duma members strike back. And this goes on, reached such a pitch, and it goes on for weeks. Finally, that Mr. Mishustin, who is a bright Mikhail Mishustin, he's a bright and I should say respected guy who is not a zealot or an ideologue. He finally said, "Look." And he said this on the floor of the Duma. He said, "Mr. Belousov, anyone holding the views you've expressed should think of resigning." That's civil war within the absolute top of the elite. Now, in terms of national television, yes, you mentioned Solovyov's program, Vladimir Solovyov. He's wildly changed his tune, but not just he. Everyone else dealing with him has changed their tune, and they're being very, very blunt at this point. The only remaining holdouts are those handful of Russians who are saying we ought to nuke Europe. And when they do say that, as they continue to do, they get a huge response from everyone else saying how idiotic this would be, suicide for us. Now, bottom line, Russia is on the domestic front has collapsed. It's not collapsing; it has collapsed. The idea that the fund that has the rainy day fund that the country built up through oil and gas sales will be depleted by the end of this year. Depleted, zero. That's what they've been paying everything from. It'll be zeroed out by the end of this year. My friend Anders Aslan has proven that very correctly. That they are back to the wall at this point. That's what I'm trying to say. And it seems to me that when President Trump comments that Russians are always victorious, and he cites Napoleon and he cites World War II, he would do well to contemplate also the Crimean War of 1853 to 1855, which was a disaster for Russia. It led to regime change, a new czar, and a total transformation, including an era of great reforms. He should be thinking also about the impact of the Russo-Japanese War, which Russia lost decisively in 1905, leading to the creation of the Duma, which still exists or has revived today. Or he should think also about the World War I defeat, which led to the collapse of the monarchy. So Russia does lose wars. We're in the midst of their doing so right now. We aren't acknowledging how desperate their situation is. And so it seems to me that we face, if I can quote Lenin, what he called a revolutionary situation in Russia. And that the president of Ukraine is entirely right to say that we want to keep pushing so that we get all our territory back. And I happen to agree with the Prime Minister of Denmark, who said yesterday in Munich that the goal should be victory. Now, the alternative is very serious to contemplate, namely a pause maybe for a few years, maybe a half dozen years, maybe even a decade, and then a return to the same old policy. So it's not enough. The American interest certainly is to support Ukraine to the hilt, but beyond that, now, thanks to the way Russia has conducted this war, the United States should be committed to winning it.
Absolutely.
Defeating Russia. End of discussion. And it's for the Russians to figure out what they want to do with themselves next, not us.
Thanks very much. And turning to the battlefield, Ambassador Herbst, Russia has suffered massive military casualties since 2022. That much is known, but we don't know exactly the numbers we're talking about. Trump gives some really big numbers on both sides. The Ukrainian side says Russian military losses are massive, but the number is somewhat uncertain. To the best of your knowledge, what do we know about the exact number of Russian casualties?
Well, we have estimates, for example, from the Ukrainians, which talk about something like over 150,000 casualties, dead and wounded. And normally the ratio is like 3.5 or 4 to 1. The British intelligence has estimated something over 750,000, so about 100,000 less, as has the Institute for the Study of War. These figures are not exact, but they are substantial. And of course, we had British estimates going back 6 months ago, 8 months ago, when the big kamikaze attacks were intensified by Russia, suggesting that for every one Ukrainian casualty, there were 5 or 5.5 Russian casualties. So I think we are seeing massive casualties on the Russian side, substantial on the Ukrainian side. And it's also true that while the mainstream media talks about slow but grinding forward Russian gains in Donbass, basically the Russian offensive there has stalled the last 3 or 4 weeks, which may well be due to the exhaustion that Vlad was talking about earlier. And it's also true that Putin does not want to enter actual negotiations on the war while the Ukrainians hold a substantial position in the Kursk Oblast of Russia. Putin famously set an October 1 deadline for the Russian forces to take back all of that oblast. And here we are towards the end of February, and the Russians are no closer to that. The Ukrainians made a very smart decision in week 3 or 4 of their offensive, which began in early August, to fortify a substantial portion of what they had taken south of the River Seine to make sure they could hold on to it for negotiations. So this is a key point too. And the Ukrainians, in fact, launched another counteroffensive in early January, which had a modest amount of success. But the point is they are well entrenched in Kursk, and they have managed at this point to largely stop the Russian advances in eastern Ukraine.
Thanks very much. You're watching How Long Can Russia Sustain Its Aggression in Ukraine, hosted by the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. I have one more round of questions for our panelists, and then we'll go to audience Q&A, so please do get your questions in to askac.org. And to our panelists for this final round, I'll encourage you all to stick to 3 minutes in your answers. Vladimir, back around to you. Could you talk about a little bit more in detail about the sanctions that the US and Europe have imposed on Russia, especially the recent ones, and the concrete economic impacts we expect to see from those sanctions?
Well, several things. First, one of the key objectives was to minimize Russia's export revenue, to reduce Russia's ability to finance the war. That was, the implementation of sanctions is not ideal, but that was significantly achieved because Russian revenue was at least capped. The way that we see that is the past 3 years, Russia has been doing with enormous deficits, which always significantly extended what was initially planned. Ministry of Finance was not able to control the spending, and revenues did not cover it. Also, export revenues do not ensure significant surplus in current accounts balance, trade balance, which suppresses the ruble and which basically also contributes to high inflation. Also, critically, Russia has faced limited access to important technology, which is why it was not able to launch import substitution on a significant scale. It's still critically dependent on imports. That negatively affects the payments balance, the ruble, the inflation, and so on. There's been much commentary about the recent sanctions against the oil sector and the so-called shadow tanker fleet by the outgoing Biden administration. In this point, I will have to say that this kind of sanctions against vessels which are shipping the Russian oil, against trading and shipping and insurance companies, takes consistency to make them effective. You cannot just impose one trove of sanctions against the shadow fleet and its operators and then sit back and relax. You need to constantly monitor how Russians are jumping from one shell company and jurisdiction to another. So it takes a significant input, manpower, and attention to actually block all these new circumvention schemes. If we see what we saw in the past months, that Office of Foreign Assets Control effectively stopped adoption of new sanctions against vessels, ship owners, shell companies operating this shadow fleet. This is what Russians want. Many of them say, we don't even need new sanctions, just let us circumvent and roam free as we want. if the US just simply stops enforcement of these oil sanctions introduced under Biden, that will be, but maybe not enough for the Russians to continue thrive with their international oil trade. But that will be a significant boost for Putin's efforts in circumventing sanctions, which is why it's really disappointing to see Trump administration actually backing away from effective enforcement of all these sanctions mechanisms.
Thank you. Dr. Sabatos, I want to give you the chance to add on to anything about energy sanctions there if you'd like. But my question to you, I mean, one of the main tools that Russia uses for its kind of malign influence, particularly in Europe, is energy flows. But as we've talked about, some of that power is decreasing a little bit. Does Russia still have the ability to use energy as leverage over its neighbors? And how can this be mitigated?
Thank you for that. I would just add to what Minister Milov said that I saw some estimates for this year. Russia's oil revenue forecast is around $110 billion. If these sanctions are enforced, then that would slash another 20%, 18 to 20%, so around $20 billion from Russia's oil revenue if enforced. And right now, about a third of Russia's shadow fleet is under sanction, and that includes also the US sanctions, UK and EU sanctions. But of course, it's a question of enforcement. We've seen India refusing some of the cargoes, but again, it's also a question of perception as well. If these sanctions are not going to be enforced, then probably there is much less interest in abiding by them, even if they remain in place. Although today I saw some statements from Mark Rubio saying that the EU should be invited to the discussion table because there are sanctions involved here. So I'm worried that he's also contemplating the possibility of unwinding them. But to go back to the question that you raised about Russia's ability to wreak havoc through energy, Russia deliberately reduced gas supplies to Europe in order to undermine Western support for Ukraine in 2022. And it created one of the biggest energy crises in the world, and certainly Europe's, leading to record prices for gas. Of course, with the end of the transit contract through Ukraine at the beginning of this year, Russia lost further market share. And right now it's only exporting via Turkey pipeline and also LNG. There will be another set of sanctions kicking in at the beginning of March in Europe, which bans the transshipment of LNG through European ports. But even if we see this massive reduction of gas through pipelines, through vessels, Russia still has the ability to influence European markets through different means, not necessarily through the molecule of gas, but through a network of connections, through propaganda. The one insidious propaganda is the fact that Russian gas is extremely cheap, so let's all go back to business as usual because it's cheap. This is the discourse that we constantly hear from German industrialists who say, well, our economy is on its knees because we've lost this cheap Russian gas. But was it really cheap? It wasn't cheap at all. Reuters had an excellent piece today saying exactly that. When we look at the figures, Russian gas wasn't actually cheap. It wasn't cheap for the Western companies, and it certainly wasn't cheap in Eastern Europe. But there is this discourse, this idea that it is cheap and everyone should revert to this gas. And of course, Russia is really pushing to return to the European, to regain its market share because it needs both revenue. It made 120 billion, a record 120 billion in 2022 out of gas sales to Europe. But since then, it lost about 10 billion euros last year and the year before as a result of this lost market share. So, as I said, even if the sanctions are in place and not and maybe deepened, Russia still has this ability to influence. And if we look at markets are moving on sentiment They're no longer moving on fundamentals. Today, because of the discussions in Riyadh, markets moved up and down again last week, and we've seen these wild volatility throughout the past month, precisely because of this. Everyone is watching what will happen to this Russian gas.
Dr. Starr, I want to go back to a point in our earlier conversation about how many of the Trump administration's statements over the last week or so have been giddily received by Kremlin-connected folks in Moscow. Russian analysts gloating about how Russian isolation is a thing of the past. Kremlin-defined interests are no longer being supposedly ignored by the West. Can you expand on just how this sort of thing has been received in Russia over the past week or so, and what that might look like going forward on the policy side in Moscow?
Well, I think that everything that's happened has produced a kind of giddy euphoria. How long this lasts remains to be seen. It depends on our actions. However, I think we have to look in the mirror also. It's not just how things are happening in Moscow. I believe they've lost the war on their own domestic front. But having lost it in any kind of deal of sort we've been talking about leaves unresolved huge issues, not just the oil and gas, which has been very knowingly discussed in this session, but also, for example, the sovereignty and welfare of the entire Baltic region. That won't be affected by any discussions I've heard about between Washington or Europe, Washington and Moscow. The Europeans would insist on it, of course, and they should. Nor Southeast Europe. We're talking about control of the Black Sea. If Crimea ends up in Russian hands, and we could easily make that concession given what we're hearing now, if Crimea ends up in Russian hands, forget Southeast Europe. They've been absolutely neutered in their international effectiveness, and we've done body blow to Turkey, which is still a NATO member. But then let's not forget the Caucasus and Central Asia. Caucasus, you have a new government, or a really quite innovative government in Armenia, radically so. Uncertain situation in Georgia. Azerbaijan is playing every card it has, and all the Central Asians feel immense pressure from Moscow. Now, if we don't have these things in our mind as we negotiate with Moscow, we're deceiving ourselves. We'll get ourselves into a situation that has consequences much worse than we are contemplating now. So it seems to me to return to my main point, we should acknowledge that Russia is stymied on the war front. It is defeated on the home front. There are a lot of problems that Russia is causing, Putin's Russia is causing in the world. We should be pushing for the resolution of those policies. And if this means change of leadership in Moscow, bravo. That's the Russians' job to do, not ours. But we should not rule it out and be fearful that, oh my goodness, there'll be loose nukes, because the Russians themselves are doing a better job of denouncing that possibility than anyone in the West has done. So that's...
Yeah. Ambassador Herbst, final question from me goes to you. Earlier in the war, we saw some amount of domestic resistance in Russia related to Russia's recruiting tactics, poor training, and essentially sending young Russian men into a meat grinder in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine primarily. How has the Kremlin reacted to this kind of public displeasure around recruitment? And where might the Kremlin turn next to bolster their forces if they do continue to press forward?
Fact that there's not great interest among Russians in actually fighting this war is a problem for Putin. And when he went to the quote unquote partial mobilization following Ukraine's successful counteroffensive in the summer and fall of 2022, anywhere from 600,000 or 700,000 to 1.5 million Russian draft-age men fled Russia. To deal with the fact that people aren't keen on fighting this war, they've been forced to regularly increase signing bonuses and the salaries for the soldiers. And so we're talking about signing bonuses, which are now topping $20,000, which is big money in Russia. Monthly salaries of $2,000 or $3,000 a month for unskilled labor, also very large salaries in Russia. And these prices have put additional pressure on the Russian economy. And partly for that, because of that, I don't know if this is the overall policy set by the Ministry of Defense or not. The Russian government is loath to acknowledge that people have died, so they don't have to pay out those sums, because there's also a death payment, and that's making people unhappy. In order to fill the ranks of their soldiers, going back to 23, they've relied on people from outside of Russia, from the Middle East, and most famously now for the past several months from North Korea. So North Korea is now a participant in a war in Eastern Europe, a fact which has not completely been recognized either by the Biden administration or now the Trump administration. One more reason for us to respond strongly, which we have yet to do. So this is clearly a problem for the Kremlin, which makes more difficult their conducting this war. Whether or not they are on their last legs, as Fred says, I don't rule it out, but I'm not certain that they are. They are certainly in a shaky position. And I would welcome a very strong policy designed to kick them out of Ukraine. That does not seem to be the policy of the Trump team. But I think the Trump team is set on making sure that Putin cannot achieve his objective in Ukraine, which is to establish effective military control, effective political control over the country. And if Trump is true to that objective, and he made that point clear again just last week, amidst the other statements made, which were not nearly as helpful, he can make that happen. He can achieve that objective. And that would suit American interests, although not as much as kicking the Russians out of Ukraine. And it could suit Ukrainian interests, although again, not as much as kicking the Russians out of Ukraine.
Thanks very much. All right, we have about 10 minutes left, and we're going to go to audience Q&A now. The first one, I think, Vladimir, you're probably best positioned for this one. It comes from Matthew Layton, who asks, the Russian central bank seems to have been quite successful in stopping a major devaluation of the ruble. Of course, high interest rates will hurt investment in Russia, and inflation continues to be an issue for them. My question, are there policy tools that Western governments haven't used yet, which could target the ruble in a way that their central bank couldn't compensate for?
I profoundly disagree that the central bank had been successful in anything. There is a lot of mythology about professionalism of the Russian central bank, but most of it actually does not correspond to actual reality. For once, Russia is currently ranked number 12 in the world by the central bank interest rate, 21%. We are only surpassed by countries like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Turkey, Iran, and some others. Pretty nice company, actually reflecting the success of Russian government economic policy. Also, ruble had depreciated significantly. They had introduced absolutely draconian measures since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Full capital controls, major restrictions on individuals and Russian citizens for owning and controlling the currency and maintaining currency, bank accounts, and so on. This did not help. Ruble has depreciated very significantly. It's currently around 100 rubles per dollar. 2.5 years ago, it was 50 rubles per dollar. So I disagree that it was in any way successful. But then again, what should Western governments do? Continue on all these points, continue the pressure on all these points that I listed above, limit Russia's revenue, limit access to technology, which prevents import substitution and Russia gaining ground in producing their own stuff. the less money Russia receives from exports and the more it is dependent on imports of finished products, the more pressure on the ruble, the more pressure on inflation. Basically, this is what we have been seeing in the past few years. I think one thing which people are missing when they judge on whether sanctions have been successful or not is everybody wants everything to happen all at once, miracles to happen fast. But basically, in 3 years' time, Western pressure and sanctions have been able to achieve significant outcomes. Near depletion of Russia's financial reserves, persistent inflation, which is the Russian central bank is not capable of bringing down, while maintaining super high interest rates that are killing the economic recovery. Doubling down on all these efforts by the Western governments is the recipe, acknowledging the temporary partial successes that have been achieved and doubling down. I think that's the clear way to go, not backing off and not revoking sanctions just at the time when they only began to work.
Yeah, I think that's an important perspective on what to actually expect from sanctions. Ora, next question is to you. This comes from Eleanor Sanders online. She asks, at Davos, President Trump mentioned encouraging the OPEC countries to increase oil production to lower the global price of oil and eat into Moscow's energy reserves. Do you think this is feasible?
Well, it would
Only
be
easy questions.
Yes. Well, I mean, of course, if the price of oil is lowered, of course, it would eat into Russia's revenues. But ultimately, it will be the decision of OPEC. And let's not forget that OPEC has been working together with Russia in the OPEC Plus format. So the decision that will be taken will also ultimately depend on Russia as well. And I doubt that the Russians will take a decision that ultimately will impact their oil revenue, particularly at this time when, as I said at the beginning, and the Minister Milov also mentioned it quite clearly, that they are at risk of losing this critical part of revenue, and oil is actually a very important part of their budget. So President Trump can say many things, but ultimately these things don't depend just on him.
Fantastic. So jump ball here to Dr. Starr and to Ambassador Herbst. This one comes from Alina Kovalchuk, who asks, Russia's military has also faced a setback with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, which jeopardized Russia's only viable continuous military presence in the Eastern Med. How might this development impact Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine and project power beyond its borders to expand its global influence and beyond strong standing for potential negotiations or whatever follows? Either of you are welcome to take a stab at that.
Of course, it's a negative. On the other hand, as Ambassador Herbst said, they are recruiting people to fight the war in Africa. They're elsewhere in the Middle East. This is what they're doing in their desperation. But this is definitely a major, major setback, financial as well as prestige and military security. Let me raise a point that hasn't come up in this discussion, and that is that Putin is not a spring chicken. He came to power a quarter century ago with a whole cadre of people who were basically his contemporaries. I knew some of them. I served as a director of a big Russian oil company, Sadako. And the same team has been in place ever since. There have been very few people purged from it, very few people added to it. And that's true in the economy and in the government and so forth. Meanwhile, we have coming up beneath them a very interesting and talented group of younger Russians whose exposure to the world is much more. They are not former KGB people in Dresden as Putin is. They're people who've traveled around, know what's up, and have different expectations. So when we ask, well, should we take a tough line on Putin, and should we be much more firm and resolute in our negotiating? The answer is yes, but not just as an end in itself, but as a way of opening Russia to a new generation, and let us hope a better generation that isn't deformed by the prejudices that have informed the Eurasian dream that has informed the Putin regime.
Ambassador Herbst, anything to add there?
About the Syrian shutdown, in other words, the fall of Assad and Moscow losing its air and sea base. It looks like they've recouped that partly in Sudan, not in the Eastern Med, but in the Red Sea, in the area, which enabled them to project power into Africa if this thing pans out as right now it seems that it will. But nonetheless, losing an ally of 50 years is a big setback. The fact that their troops were engaged in Ukraine is an important reason for that setback, and that is well understood around the world.
Ambassador Herbst, a final question to you here for the last word. This one comes from Jim Gilmore, who asks about, there's I think a tendency in the media to talk about how Russia is advancing in the East slowly but at a high cost. But now there are some reports that actually that advance has stopped. What can you share about that?
No, Governor Gilmore is absolutely right. There has been some reporting about this in mainstream media in the last week or two, but not much. And so the general conversation about the Russian military operations is still that they are grinding forward, and that's not quite true. And again, they've, if anything, lost a little bit of territory in Kursk. And again, Kursk has proved to be a brilliant move by the Ukrainians, not well understood by the Biden administration at the time, and still not sufficiently well understood today. Putin does not want to negotiate while Ukraine holds Russian territory. And I don't think that the Trump team has registered that yet as they figure out what to do.
Thanks very much. I guess final question here to anyone. This one comes from Yuri Uzdemir. Very pertinent to what we're talking about here. How long can Russia support the replenishment of the human losses that they're forced to undertake in the East to continue the war? Anyone have a timeline?
May I?
If I can jump. Yeah, sorry.
Dr. Starr, go ahead. 30 seconds, and then Vladimir, 30 seconds. We'll close it up.
It's not just how long, and that depends just on the degree of savagery that Putin wants to impose on the people, but rather how long, how deep into the future will this impact the fate of Russia? That's the question we're not asking, and they're not asking, and they should, because they're more than mortgaging the future every day that passes.
Vladimir, you get the last word.
Yeah, I think when it comes down to Russia's ability to wage major offensive operations, we probably already have reached a breaking point. So the recent slowdown in Russian advances is the material proof of that. To hold on the current positions, to bombard Ukraine, they still have ability to do so. But major advances, I don't think they have any more manpower for that.
That seems like an appropriate place to end our discussion today. Thank you to all our speakers for joining us, sharing their insights and their time, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. To stay up to date on all things Eurasia Center, events and analysis, and everything else we do, please follow @AC Eurasia on Twitter and subscribe to our Ukraine Alert blog. That'll keep you fully in the loop. And we'll be doing much more on Russia, Ukraine, and the US very soon. Thanks very much.